Today's topic is building a modern privacy tech stack. So, if you are a leader in your privacy or consulting another company or working individually in the operations or management of privacy program, one of the key questions is how can you use privacy technology to automate some of the things? How can you save time, reduce risk, show ROI to the business of privacy? And these are all topics that we're going to discuss today. With that, I'll start with introductions. So, hey everyone, I'm V. I'm the founder and CEO of Privado.ai. Came from a product management background prior to starting Privado, worked with legal team on GDPR compliance. At Privado, we help companies who have engineers who are innovating fast to continue to build products fast, innovate fast without breaking any privacy laws. We do that by scanning code. We have a privacy code scanning solution that provides privacy teams instant visibility into data flows and help operationalize privacy by design in the software development lifecycle. Over to you, Tariq, for your introduction as well.
Yeah, hello everyone. My name is Tariq Yusuf, he, him pronouns. I have been working about a decade in the tech industry in a number of different roles, like started in DevOps, SRE, worked on building secure software for Google Cloud, and moved into privacy about 6 years ago. And but it's funny, I think the first day I was a privacy engineer was right after GDPR came in. So it was kind of funny timing with that. And I've been working in the data privacy space, kind of on everything from doing privacy reviews to designing infrastructure and figuring out data discovery, kind of the whole gamut. I just graduated from the UW Law School with a master's specifically focusing in privacy law, because I figured that since I'm talking to lawyers often, I should probably understand the legal jargon. And so I'm coming in kind of with that lens of both implementing it from an engineering perspective and also understanding some of the legal frameworks that apply.
Yeah, and that's the exciting point of view you bring to the table, Tariq. I mean, your journey is reverse, which is from an engineer moving towards privacy and then specializing in the law as well. And yeah, for a lot of folks, it's the other way around, where they probably studied the law part first, but then are now operationalizing. So I think it's privacy is an exciting place because of exactly that reason. A lot of people have come in via different angles. So it'll be fun to talk through these things. So yeah, on today's agenda, majorly, we're going to first start with why do you need even privacy technology, or how do you identify the right needs to purchase, buy, build privacy technology in your company, for your privacy program. The second thing we're going to look at the current landscape, different type of technology or different solutions that you need. How do you evaluate different vendors? Tariq has I think has a worldwide experience of that. He did like a large exercise recently, so he can share through that, including like pitfalls, uh, common pitfalls. How do you select things that can go wrong or things that should go right? And finally, Q&A. As I said, feel free to ask questions along the way. If you have a burning question, don't wait till the end. And with that, let's begin. So Tariq, why don't we start by if you can address on when someone is trying to select or even buy, build a privacy technology tool, where should one start? Or even from that need identification perspective, where should that journey really for a privacy person?
Yeah, so kind of like starting from the very, very basic level. One of the things that you'll often see is that you'll have folks that are looking for technology to solve everything, including the program. So having figuring out how you're going to actually deal with the human exercise that comes with privacy. So that's figuring out, who is going to own it. Like, is it going to be more of a legal function? Is it going to be more of an engineering function? What are the needs of your organization? Like you and I, V, we've had more experience working in kind of very, tech heavy organizations where there's a lot of custom code and stuff that we have to scan manually. Some others, they, more or less you put a bunch of SaaS companies in a trench coat and that's you build your business around that, right? And those are distinctly different technology needs. And then finally figuring out um, who are the like champions within your organization. Maybe it's a manager that works on your like trust and safety operation. Maybe it's your, often cases it's probably your general counsel. And so kind of figuring out who those key folks are. Once you get that, then you can start thinking about, okay, how is the technology going to start working towards that? And the first thing is kind of going from the unknown unknowns to the known unknowns. And by that, I mean data discovery and understanding what it is that you have. There's a whole bunch of parts of the privacy program, but just understanding where things are is such a key part of that. Once you get that, then you can start thinking about here's all of the cool things that you can do with like, different pets and anonymization and differential privacy. Like that comes kind of towards the end of kind of the middle to towards the end of that journey.
Makes sense. So start with the why, setting up the structure of the privacy program, identifying the champions, the people side of the equation, and then going in the technology. You did mention like the foundational piece is that getting answered, going from that unknown unknown to the known unknowns, which is that initial visibility. I always basically like to say or ask privacy professionals this question: hey, can you draw a chart or whatever this simplified version of this chart for your company? And the answer usually is no. So yeah, I just wanted to get your take on, I know we touched a little bit about the user journey, especially on personal data. How do you view that in the larger equation of the privacy program and trying to get that visibility? Where does the user sits in?
Yeah, no, and this is something I think I tend to approach a little bit differently from a lot of other folks that I've worked with. Um, a key part here is to start with what the users or the customer experience is, right? And you work in product management, you understand kind of the criticality of that. Uh, but the reason for that is that because like privacy is a regulatory problem, but it's also a trust problem, right?
Mhm.
Uh, in order to have that, because when you lose privacy, you lose trust and goodwill from customers. And so understanding how customers interact and what their relationship is with your product is a key part of that experience. So one of the exercises I really optimally like to do is kind of stepping into an organization, or maybe you're starting a program for the first time, looking at, okay, what is the product itself? What are the few journeys that people go through? Is it a relatively, maybe you're at a organization that has just like one app and it's there's a couple of key journeys and that's most users interaction with it. Is this something the users are interacting with every day? Is there background data being collected you know like a location history map or something like that? So understanding that can give you a perspective of what the customer journey is. And then from there, you can start tying that to different pieces of infrastructure. And this is kind of one of those steps where you kind of investing in this early can make that process of understanding that broader data risk a little bit easier down the road. Uh, Once you do that, a lot of effectively what makes a lot of data discovery, data inventory, and things like that challenging is you're documenting tribal knowledge, for
Yeah.
lack of a better term. Like there's, you're an organization with say, 500, 1,000, 2,000 engineers. And then maybe you had like, a total of like 5,000 engineers that have rolled through that organization at some point in time, and you have a bunch of legacy code and whatnot. A big part of it is just understanding what are the like, let's document where, for lack of a better term, where the skeletons are buried, where the
Yeah.
risks are, so that we know like where the pitfalls are to avoid them. And then what becomes really interesting from the engineering perspective is we can start building some automation around that. You can say, hey, you shouldn't call this service, this is a deprecated service. Or, hey, you shouldn't, this is not one of the vendors we can send this type of PII to, and so on and so forth. So kind of wrapping that all up, starting from understanding how the customer is experiencing the product and how your
Yeah.
employees are experiencing the product, because employees are data subjects as well, and they
Yeah.
also have those privacy rights. And then figuring out how can you use a technology solution to kind of augment that that documentation process.
Yeah. That makes sense. I mean, and starting from that rough consumer journey also helps make the right decision, as you said. So if you're a pure e-commerce store, for most purposes, your journey is going to start from your website and mobile app. Whereas if you are a hybrid where you do run physical stores and you have an e-commerce, then you have an additional journey which is happening in the store through that POS system and the ERPs connected to it. Is that in-house or is that external? So you can broadly, I know you can't fill the complete boxes, but you can broadly start with like a rough picture, and then you can decide on which path to focus on depending on the journey risk as well. That makes a lot of sense to me. Um, Also, Tariq, a bit of question between, I know when we are thinking of data discovery, a large focus of the privacy industry has been to scan data at rest, right? Which means data in a database, data in an unstructured place like, or even warehouse like Snowflake databases, or S3 buckets, or Google Drive, things where data sit in for a long time. And there is, of course, risk there from a security perspective. There's risk there from a privacy perspective as well. Um, when you think of software, which is that mobile app website that you were talking about, and data, which is data living in a database, how do you look at the two? What are the risks in code versus data? How should privacy teams think about the software piece?
Yeah, no, I think you kind of hit the nail right on the head. Data scanning is kind of one of the common things there, and the big thing that is challenging from starting with data scanning, in my opinion, is you get the data, but you miss the context of the data. Um, if you have like a very, very organized set of tables or, uh, AWS or GCP resources, and you know like which services this mapped to, it could be an easier question. But just knowing that some either some table in Salesforce or some S3 bucket has these three bits of data, these three types of data in there in isolation is a bit more challenging to kind of unpack, because then you have to look at each of those things and say, okay, who accesses this database? Who accesses this vendor? And try to kind of, you know, take an archaeological journey back through who's making those calls. And then you have to start digging through any materials that you have. The thing that excites me about static analysis is that you can understand which processes are happening from the code level, because you know what APIs are being called, you know which um, database configurations are being included. And so you can have an understanding of the automated processing that comes through. Now, if you have like the one-off cases where like, you know, someone needs to copy some data to an S3 bucket for some vendor to pick up or import, like that's where data discovery can maybe help with that. And there's not really a whole lot you can do from a static analysis perspective. But it gives you some of that context because it's easier to go look at a code repo and say, I know what this repo is used for X, Y, or Z. And then from there saying, okay, I know it's hitting these table, I know it's hitting like DynamoDB and Zendesk, but I am not sure why it's connecting to S3, right? And then it can help you have a better understanding of the context behind data and understand and be able to start more quickly identifying here are maybe some risks for remediation that we want to capture. And that's, I think, the big advantage that you have from this perspective is that you kind of, if especially if you're a engineering heavy organization, it helps you kind of get to a path of value a little bit quicker, which especially for privacy programs is kind of critical because um, depending on where you are in in your organization, maybe you're doing this as kind of a regulatory response, maybe and maybe you're trying to convince that hey, you need a broader privacy operation, or like hey, you're trying to go for ISO 27701 certification or things like this where you need to show a lot of depth, and being able to show a little bit of depth with a limited amount of resources can sometimes help grease the wheels for saying, okay, now we need to start building out a technical review process when you start building out privacy infrastructure teams and all of that.
Yeah, I fully agree, especially that time to value concept. If as privacy professionals we can show value faster, then it's kind of like unlocking resources for the next level. As if you've shown ROI at the base level, then you get more resources for the next level. That completely makes sense to me. One question that at least this year has been a highlight for a lot of fines and FTC actions has been third-party data sharing. And that's again kind of little confusing that I wanted your opinion on. So there's of course the bigger apps like Google Drive, or I think Atlassian also maybe has some APIs. So there's some third parties, maybe like Workday, you can get into and scan and see what data lives into that. But as privacy teams, typically in a company might have 200, 300 third parties they are using. Some of that goes through the employees, some of that goes through the software. So if you can just shine a light on how does data get shared to these third parties, and where a data discovery approach could work, where a code scanning approach could work for that.
Yeah, no, this is a really good case. I think one of the things that I think I know I personally underrated for some time is in addition to your normal privacy tooling, um, explore shadow IT. Like this is actually a really, really good case for shadow IT because um it looks, shadow IT software is going to look at what is your company paying for, and then be able to get you maybe a list of vendors that you can start with that you should kind of keep an eye out for, right?
Yeah.
um so that can get you like at least a starting part of here's the different things that are the key parts of our organization, right? Like I was working with an organization where we discovered we had we were paying like a third party WordPress um management site. And so we were able to go and reach out to that team and figure out, hey, like what are you using this WordPress site for? Right. That would have been something we wouldn't have gotten through like data discovery and code scanning, because we need to know where things are to start
Mhm.
looking, right? Um, so that's a good place, I think, to start. And then once you start doing kind of code scanning, like being able to you can start picking up some of those APIs where kind of things are going through. The like the kind of the low stakes one, the not low stakes, but the kind of first thing that you can kind of start looking at is just looking at what code are you including on any front end.
Mhm.
um you had the Sephora case a while back. You had the uh what's the therapy app? I can't even remember the name. I hear their ads all the time, but you have that app that was sharing data with Facebook, or Meta using the Pixel. So looking at kind of what's um, injected onto your website is a good first step to think through there. And then once you kind of get that's kind of the first band-aid that you want to put on. And because that one is the can be relatively high risk because you have code being injected onto your website, and it's also very, very clear that data is going to a third party in that case.
Very visible. Yeah.
Yeah. So once you start getting that, then you can kind of go and look at our back end and see, what other things are kind of going through. Because in a lot of cases, the back end stuff is it looks a lot more innocuous comparatively. Like, okay, you have a Meta Pixel and a Google Pixel for advertising context. You're not really gonna just be like, you know, most of the time, I'd say 9 times out of 10, your backend code is not going to be just sending stuff over to Google and Facebook. Like you might have a sync job for remarketing for your phone numbers, but like it's going to look pretty innocuous. Like, okay, you're batching a bunch of things to go through SendGrid. You're processing offline transactions with Stripe. Uh, and so that would be kind of the, I guess, the layer of prioritization that we'd go through in that process. Kind of rambled a little bit through that story, but
Oh, yeah, that makes sense. Especially like websites and with the SpongeBob case, I think was that app with the California AG. Now it's mobile app and SDKs too. So kind of anything which is visible that people can download, test, look at the actual network calls on their phones and, or on a computer by simulating the phone, those could be the first starting point. And also like these third-party code are designed to, again, for a lack of better words, suck in data as much as possible. So yeah, that's where those risky data flows lie as well. Awesome. Um, Moving on, kind of also looking at how do we look at the current privacy tech landscape. Wanted to begin with like all the needs that privacy teams have, and as you can see on the screen, there are a ton of needs or solutions that privacy team are looking for. As the team think about the entire landscape or about buying tools, how should they think about buying one tool that solves all these problems or looking at specialized tools? What's your opinion there? How do they navigate this complex maze?
yeah, it is certainly a complex maze. I think simultaneously, a lot of privacy and GRC vendors, there's a lot of people working in this space, but it's also the quality, especially with relationship to how it's going to fit in your organization, varies a lot. Um, I think before you look that, I think one of the things that we should baseline here is that um, mapping and inventory is just the tip of the iceberg here. The goal here is to build in a lot of the broader functions that rely on understanding what data you have. Like we have here, kind of this operation and governance split is something I really like because you want to make sure that you're able to, for lack of a better term, maintain a registry of documented risk. More often than not, when a organization gets in trouble with an auditor or with a regulator, it's because they ignored risk. So
Yeah.
documenting it is actually a much safer thing to do because you can say, hey, this is why we decided not to do this because we have these other priorities. And maybe you're wrong on that, but at least shows that you're thinking about these things, which is great from both an internal and external perspective. Then the other side is building out kind of that, that like the governance angle here. Once you understand what data you have, then you can start figuring out, okay, how do we build this into our engineering culture? How do we start talking with engineers earlier on about being aware of how data is um, being used in their organization? When we're building um, either machine learning models or training sets for large language models, what data are we actually putting in there? How do we deal with questions of memorization and stuff like this? A lot of these problems become enabled by visibility. And so kind of starting with understanding that there is a larger journey that comes from there. The visibility may take a long time to do. Like, one of the clients I'm working with is like, it was a year to get a starting point of visibility. And it's a good milestone, but there's more to build from there. So kind of rolling back to vendors in the space, it is really, really tempting for a number of reasons to go with one vendor because there's a cost associated with doing that vendor discovery process, sitting through hours and hours of sales calls, eventually to try to get to an engineer, and then talking with the engineer about how these different pieces work. I think in the recent project that you mentioned, I think I was on over 30 hours of sales calls, just evaluating like 5 or 6 vendors, like a short list that I put together. Um, and the so I understand the kind of the temptation of that, and there's a lot of vendors that try to be kind of this all-in-one solution, right? And that can work sometimes. I think the question here is understanding where the gaps are in the different pieces of functionality. One of the advantages that you tend to have with a lot of these vendors is that they'll kind of modularize their offerings, so they won't have like one flat rate option. They'll say, okay, you know, our data discovery piece is X, our you know, DSAR component is Y, so on and so forth, right? And so thinking about, does the functionality itself serve the, I guess, the requirements that your organization has? And if you go down, like, what are the things I would ask vendors, vendor sales folks? Okay, imagine that we go down your happy path. We go down the fantastic path that gets us the most value in your eyes of a customer story. What does that look like? And then once you get that picture, you can start taking apart, like, hey, what are some points where we may have some gaps? Like, for example, maybe you have some proprietary, like, say, okay, you use Kubernetes, but maybe you have some middleware or something that does that interfacing for you, or infrastructure automation. Does it work with those toolings? So, or maybe you don't want to give a bunch of permissions broadly to something to scan AWS. How does it deal with those cases? So understand kind of what those requirements are can help kind of some of the buyer's remorse cases that you might have. It takes a lot longer, trust me, but it's a critical part of this process. Once you have, and then as you're kind of going through, you can look at other vendors to see, okay, what's the complementing value that they have. This is kind of where, you know, your good engineering practices come in. You want to see where you can build levels of indirection so that you're not locked into one particular vendor, and figure out how to connect and aggregate these different pieces together. And this was actually something, you know, when we were talking the first time with one of the, you know, this was part of one of the clients that we were working with. You know, privacy code scanning is just kind of one part that gets you a lot of these values. But, like, you know, privacy code scanning isn't going to give you consent or DSAR, right? It's not going to give you incident management. It's not going to necessarily give you they'll give you parts of monitoring and auditing, but not the whole thing. So the component that comes in there is what are the ways that we can kind of integrate and tape these pieces together? And that is, I think, something where you have to kind of look at the resources that you have available to you and figure out, are we able to kind of, what's the kind of I guess, the trade-off of taping these different pieces together ourselves and going with other vendors, and kind of building in that patchwork, right? So I think it's kind of there's not an easy answer to this type of question, but it's at least worth having the conversation so you know kind of where the gaps are and where the differential value is coming in. Because, like, I mean, optimally, from like say security perspective, I want to have one vendor and everything's in there. I don't have to expand my range of trust there. But making sure that you at least kind of have that open conversation to start with, and kind of working from there, I think, is something that we'll have to see a lot more of, especially as you have more and more solutions coming into the privacy technology space, or the privacy program technology space.
Yeah, makes sense. And we'll circle back on this one when we're looking at the pitfalls in the vendor selection. But just on the baseline, on the visibility front, I know that's the piece that takes the most for privacy teams, and there are multiple approaches that one could take. And Tariq, I'm sure, like, you've done all three, like, you know, relying just on assessments like every other privacy team, scanning data discovery. You've experience with privacy code scanning as well, so all three. So would be great to learn from you. What's the advantages, disadvantages between each? When does each approach fit best? as a company when they're trying to build that baseline visibility.
Yeah, no, it's kind of funny. Like, I think starting in privacy, like around GDPR, and I'm sure you had this experience as well. We kind of really relied on just like piles of Google Docs to
Yeah.
understand where everything is, and where, where data is stored, sending it out to hundreds of people in the organization, if not thousands, and then trying to kind of patchwork those into some sort of registry. It's a very taxing process. It's very expensive when you consider all the time and energy that it takes. And it's a long time to go and actually execute that and try to compile that to something meaningful. And so it's interesting, kind of you kind of looking at when you were doing our prep, I really liked this table because it kind of shows kind of almost in some ways like that the kind of phases of visibility building that we've seen in the privacy program space, right? We're kind of at the data discovery phase right now, and kind of moving into this static analysis and code scanning section. And that the big thing is that part, like the spoiler here is that you need kind of all three of these to build your program successfully. Privacy scanning and static analysis gets you context. It gets you an understanding of this is how data is flowing through a specific service, or flowing through um, a piece of code, um, and where it's going to. Once you have that, then you can kind of go to the data discovery to figure out, okay, how far has that gone, more or less. You have maybe kind of the starting node of this maze, or this graph, and now you can kind of start splaying out to figure out where the different parts that this is captured. Um, and maybe where there's parts, like you mentioned, unstructured data discovery, like you're storing a bunch of images somewhere, maybe your static analysis doesn't catch that, but you know that there's a connection to that data, that S3 bucket, right? And then once you have that, you can take this whole picture of a service. And this is really the dream case here. You have the context from your repository, the data that you've discovered at rest tied to that repository. And then you can go and bring it to the engineer and says, hey, this is what we've seen here. Is this consistent with your understanding of how this service works? That is way less work for an engineer to go and do, because they can go and just see, yeah, like that's a pretty accurate story, or no, like we actually are not using this right now. And it's also an opportunity for you know educating on what, you know how do we think about privacy, and how do we, you know look at things at a more holistic level. It's the analogy that comes in is like, I can't remember the name of the show, but where they take celebrities and they do their ancestry thing, and they see this whole map, and they discover parts of themselves that, like, I knew these parts, but I didn't know these parts. And so I almost kind of view it as that kind of experience in a lot of ways. And the thing I love about this is, like, I work on privacy, but ultimately, like, I'm a tech person at heart, and so that moment of joy of just something that works is something I always really appreciate. And I think that's the thing here, is that privacy feels often like a very heavy chore for a lot of people. And so to really be able to bring it to this point here of saying, here is like where everything, here's kind of what we are able to tell based on everything that's already there. It's honestly kind of a really, really magical experience, like as an engineer, to be able to see that. And so I think that, like, circling back, these are kind of the phases of where this data discovery question has gone. And so I think as we're moving more, with having more tools and offerings to go there, whether they're tools like Privado, or whether there's functionality from different vendors themselves, like Snowflake or others, it's part of building this maybe 70% accurate picture there, that you can later have that manual attestation to say, yeah, this is how this works.
Makes sense. No, that's great. Um, So another thing, as you mentioned, that was probably like 30 hours or more of the sales uh, calls you went through with different vendors and probably even more before that. What are the key things that went into that, or your evaluation criteria when you were deciding between these vendors? How should other privacy folks think of that?
Yeah, and like I'll caveat here with I'm approaching this from an engineering perspective because like I'm an engineer at heart. That's what I enjoy doing. Um, the first thing that I really did here is like what are the requirements for data inventory in the organization? Because having a company or organization wide repository of like what data we have and what systems we're using is very useful for reasons beyond privacy.
Mhm.
So looking at ways where you can maybe merge with other initiatives in the organization, like, hey, maybe IT is trying to do a catalog of SaaS services that we're paying for. Maybe security is already having their own inventory of security risk with different AWS resources. So starting with there and kind of understanding where's the broader impact within the organization. And honestly, this doesn't take a whole lot. It's just getting a matter of getting the right people in the room and kind of getting all of those things together. Maybe you don't address all of those, but at least it builds visibility across the organization and gives you an idea of maybe here's how we want to build that out, um, uh, build that solution out a little bit later. Once you start there, I think then you can start maybe looking at what makes sense to do based on the resources we have. Is it make sense for us to build a solution, buy a solution, whatnot? The one thing I can't emphasize enough is that you need to have um, you need to have experts and champions within your organization that uh, know how it should look. Because one of the things that you often see is that you'll have someone who like maybe knows we have to do a privacy thing, right? But uh doesn't know, maybe it doesn't have a picture or hasn't gotten through the full picture of what does it actually take to go there. And they'll honestly look to the vendor to solve that problem,
Mhm.
which is, that it can get you like maybe anywhere like up to like maybe 70% of the way there. But the thing is, like, fundamentally, like that person doesn't understand your organization, and their job is to sell to you. And so you're going to get that's where you'll kind of get a lot of dissatisfaction often with privacy vendors, or maybe some uh, uncomfortable conversations, is because they're trying to sell to you and trying to fit your story into their customer story when maybe that doesn't actually make sense. So you need someone who can be in that room that has the privacy expertise and understanding and can be kind of critical internally within your organization and have ask some of those detailed questions as far as how that works in real life. Um, a lot of vendors have a very strong opinionated, like they'll have one or two strong opinionated perspectives of how privacy should be solved. And if you don't fit in with that mentality, it's gonna be a lot of friction in that relationship, and it can make your implementation journey take a lot longer. Um, so that's one of the things that I'd really like stress is get some expert within your organization that kind of understands both how your organization works and can bring in some of that privacy perspective. You want to have someone that can kind of champion that on your side. And then one of the other things is also thinking, your and I know we talked about like this earlier as far as like, should you get like a single vendor versus like multiple vendors? One of the things you want to think about is like you're thinking about, say, like, and you're thinking about data inventory right now and data discovery. Eventually, that you're going to have the conversation about DSARs. You're going to have the conversation about consent management. You're going to have the conversation about assessments. And this is why I like asking the question of give me your best give me your optimal customer journey. What do you hope that your customers all end up to? And that will lead them to talk about like, hey, here's our data inventory solution, and here's all the solutions that you can kind of build off from there. And you can get an idea of what those pieces look like. But just so you have an understanding of that, because that just little extra maybe hour and a half of investment can be really valuable because you can understand this is where they want to build us to in their journey. Does that actually match with our long-term vision of where we're prepared to build our program? And if not, what are the opportunities for us to kind of diverge in that approach? Like one of the things I end up asking a lot is, you know, like what APIs are available or asking for API documentation. Because you're under NDA at that point, so they'll often be willing to send you kind of API documentation. Um, and B, I also I'll kind of present and poke holes in some of the story. Like I'm not sure if this is going to work for us. One of the things I'll keep in mind is if they say, well, we have an API for that. That is code for you're going to have to figure out how to do that with our tools, which can be fine. But recognize that that's usually an indicator that you're going against our customer journey in a little in a sense. So you're going to have to prepare for some additional work.
Not out of the box. That makes sense to me. Um,
Yeah.
And Tariq, there's a related question to the last point you were making about knowing the right peoples or involving the right people in the Q&A, which is around like, think of yourself as someone who's, let's say, a privacy program manager or a privacy manager. Who do you see can successfully champion your need for privacy tech stack, especially if you don't have a C-suite leader who supports data privacy? Who could those champions be?
Yeah. No, I'd say one of the first things that you can do, it's a fantastic question, is start with finding a engineering allies in your organization. I'm going to assume that you're in some sort of like engineering organization here. Um, if you have engineers that work on, say, risk infrastructure or maybe data engineering infrastructure, they can at least start building that picture of why you need to have an understanding of these different components. Maybe they can help you craft that story of here's how these different components are causing friction or manual processes or whatever, um, and help you build that story of how it will make that process a lot easier. Optimally, like you want to have someone that has you know has privacy engineering experience. It's worth considering, like, is there, if you don't have those allies in your organization, it's worth considering like a consultant that can talk specifically to like what the longer term value is, and being especially if you go, regardless of which route you go, having that conversation of where, your C-suite leaders here, what are they focused on? What are their prioritization? Like, you have a C-suite leader that say, like a C-suite leader that's worried about, hey, we need to get the compliance stuff taken care of. Like, let's just get what we need to do for the compliance, right? Regardless if you have an internal engineering ally or a privacy engineering consultant, sitting down with them and figuring, okay, what are the angles that we can use to kind of approach this problem. One of the things I love to do with more compliance focused organizations is saying that, hey, the process of going through and having to go and document all of these things is very, very expensive. And so framing it in terms of a cost savings thing, like this is also very useful for a build versus buy things. You have some organizations that are so, their initial gut reaction is so averse to any sort of third party that they want to build it themselves first and say, can we build it ourselves first? One thing I actually did is like, okay, like here's maybe I didn't spend I spent like maybe 30 minutes, an hour. Like here's kind of a rough estimate of what it would take to build ourselves. And when I went to the procurement conversation, like this is the amount of money that we'd spend in FTE equivalent to go and solve this problem versus this and get a proof of concept in an estimated like 6 months, right? So figuring out it's kind of a combination of, one, understanding, having someone that can champion and understand how to talk to those leaders in a way that in a language that they understand, and then two, having someone with that privacy expertise.
Makes sense. And moving on, like some pitfalls that you've seen in the general pitfalls in vendor selection. We'll go through some of them. Probably we touched on them. I think especially this point attempting to use one vendor. So I'm going to move to the next one. Yeah, I think we see this a lot as well, Tariq. So yeah, if you want to drop in any points, I'm going to unroll all the pitfalls I know because we've discussed some of them as we were talking. So feel free to pick the ones that make sense now and expand.
Yeah, no, and I think all of these kind of go back to kind of those mistakes that can happen. And this is, the suggestions that I have here are really kind of centered around these pitfalls. Like understanding, like the first one, understanding what their view of the customer journey
Mhm.
is really helpful to figure out like what can this vendor actually solve for you, and being able to kind of um and honestly, I take this from like doing privacy reviews. Like when I sit with a product manager, I ask, tell me what's the customer journey, what's the user journey here, and walk me through what that experience is like. I'm as you can see, like I really like smart hardware and like smart home hardware. And so when I was working with smart home, you know product managers in the smart home space, like how do you actually use this, what's the experience with it? And then you can start figuring out, okay, how do you actually poke some holes in that, and that you already have that experience kind of coming from a data privacy space, right? So being able to kind of bring that critical lens into this vendor conversation, I think is a little bit helpful. The vendor for subject matter expertise, this is, I think, something I really cannot emphasize enough. Like, yes, the salesperson may have like IAPP certifications, they may understand all the components of it. But just like you wouldn't go to opposing counsel for legal advice about your own case, don't go to someone else's privacy expert for privacy advice for your organization. Like the same rule applies. Like they're a lawyer, they're not your lawyer, and so it's not your legal advice. You want to take that same mindset here when you're relying on expertise from other organizations. And like, if not, at the very least, view it in the sense that their priorities and their incentives are different than yours. Like they want to close the deal, they want to get a sale, and they want to move on to kind of the next sales opportunity. You're trying to solve something that you're going to be sticking with for, at least a year, maybe 2 years. And so making sure that you have those incentives lined up and you have people that can champion your cause in the organization. Like we talked, I was watching a talk that was like, a good lawyer is worth their weight in gold. A good privacy engineering consultant is worth their weight in gold because they can save from making these really expensive mistakes later on, save from having to do the awkward conversation of, hey, this vendor relationship isn't working out. I had to break bad news to a vendor at one point where it's like, this is not just quite working out for what we're looking for here. The cross-functional consensus is this is good. But the one thing, like you want cross-functional, you want cross-functional input, but not necessarily consensus. And what do I mean by that? I mean, like I talked earlier, you want to be able to see, okay, what are the different use cases that we could have for the tooling that we're bringing in? Like data inventory, I said, has a lot of applications outside of privacy, right? The challenge here is you don't want perfect to be the enemy of done. Um, and it can be really, really difficult getting so many people in a room and trying to ramp them up on all the context of decision making and try to get to a single decision. It's kind of the too many cooks in the kitchen problem. And so being able to figure out how you can, and this a lot of this is kind of relationship building, the organization, and trust building. Work with the people in your organization that maybe feel that they want to have a say in this, and try to figure out kind of what's their, like what's the, you know for lack of a better term, what's the minimum they need to see to be like at least okay with this, or what can you build trust, say, don't worry, like I have this use case. One of the things I love here is talk with the vendors like, hey, can you do a proof of concept for us? um this is something that was really, really helpful. I know like we did a proof of concept for one of the clients that we work with, and it's super helpful because if you've done this requirements gathering, you have a list of this is what we want to see in order to be able to move forward, which helps that proof of concept conversation.
Yep.
Because the thinking putting kind of the looking at both of the hats, like you as like someone who's selling privacy technology. You don't want to have like you don't want to like you don't want to give the product away, right? Um, and you want to say, okay, like, can we have this like a limited period of time, like 2, 3 weeks, a month, or whatever? The key behind that, and talking with just different vendors I've worked with, is that they just want to know that you have a criteria by which you're thinking about it.
Yeah.
Like, they want to make sure that you close the deal and they want to make sure that you're satisfied, but they want to make sure they're not giving away the product for free. And so as you go through that requirements building process, you'll have a kind of a detailed list of here's all the things that we need for our organization. And you can give that, you can, honestly, I copied and pasted it from our requirements doc into things that I sent to vendors. It's like, this is the requirements that we want to try to evaluate in our POC. So when we have our weekly POC meeting, we can say, how are we doing on all of these things? And it can help us really make sure that we're giving this um, a good test before we continue going. And it
Yeah,
also helps you discover blockers within your organization.
exactly.
Yeah.
Also, like even for the vendors, it's much easier to disqualify themselves early in the process. So it actually saves your time and vendors' time too. So you'll end up like, hey, this is not possible for us. We're probably the wrong vendors for that. So yeah, that part helps across the board in saving time and internally, externally both.
Yeah. And I think something that actually, I think I didn't realize until like doing, like really kind of going through this process a little bit is it also helps you kind of understand what's that support relationship going to look like, right?
Yeah,
Like every organization has you know, most of the people watching this maybe are not necessarily going to be like the biggest fish in the pond for a vendor, right? The vendor is probably going to have someone bigger than them. It's probably going to have someone that's more important than them. And so, but by having this conversation and figure out where their shortcomings are, you can figure out kind of what kind of relationship are we going to have? Where are we on their roadmap prioritization? Like say, hey, we want this functionality. Where when do you think you can get that put together? Are you willing to do that? And it can kind of figure out that can build up your relationship longer term to figure out, what's that support story going to look like? Because I think this is something that we think of POCs primarily as testing the technology. It's also testing the relationship
yeah,
fundamentally, right? And if, and I think it's worth considering going with a vendor that maybe doesn't have as much of the sauce that you want, but the team that you're working with on the vendor side is very invested in prioritizing and can show that execution. Um, and so that's actually something that I really think a lot about now when I'm coming into a lot of these conversations. Um, and then like the last one, or aligning that's the aligning the user story part. Like you want to make sure you want to make sure that their happy path for you is also where you want your happy path to be. And this honestly, this goes back to the question that we got earlier. If you have a C-suite leader that's talking to you and saying, I just need a I need a ROPA because we know a regulator is going to ask for a ROPA.
yeah,
Like you're probably going to be a little bit less interested in exploring the stories of AI governance, a little less interested in the story of like DSARs and stuff like that. Like they're going to be things that you're thinking about, but thinking about what the most important parts of the stories are, because you are going to craft this narrative. And I mean, like from your perspective, that person's the champion for your product in your client organization. And so as someone who's going to serve that role, you want to make sure that you understand where the vendor wants you to go and how that fits in with your story so that when you go and make that ask to your C-suite leader saying, hey, we're going to spend X amount a year after a POC phase for this, here's here's kind of how it fits. And honestly, this is kind of one of the cases where here's where the risks are, because like if you put that all here and you show that you've done all these things, that helps so much because like C-suites are busy. They don't want to have to think about everything. So if you can say, here's benefits, here's the risks, here's our recommendation, like that is an easy conversation to have.
awesome. Yeah, I guess this kind of sums up. I know we're almost 3 minutes away, so I want to give some time to questions as well, but kind of summarizes the last point on a lot of key takeaways that we were chatting through the talk on. How do you think about building the tech stack, the modern privacy tech stack, different ways of doing things? With that, I will open it up for questions. Feel free to put it in the Q&A. I know there's one question which is already there. But yeah, you can see the box there, put it there. I'll be able to pick it up. So, Tariq, one question I have for you is, so there's this person who's saying they have an assessment for visibility or overall privacy program. They have an assessment-based approach. They procured like a data discovery tool, and eventually I think probably one of the pitfall, maybe didn't consult IT at that point of time. The integrations were a lot or were very resource heavy, so that tool did not get adoption and that went away. Now, when they have to make further arguments of either adding a new tech solution, like let's say ours privacy code scanning or DSAR or consent, how do they do that when they have a failed privacy tech implementation?
Yeah, this is very challenging because you're going in with your tail between your legs in some sense. I think the big thing is showing that you've learned from whatever the pitfalls were, whatever the mistakes were, and you've taken action to go and mitigate them. Like, and this is something that I've had to help teams do, where it's like, hey, we made the wrong decision here. In our case, we had some goodwill from the organizational leadership here, but if you're having maybe one that's a little bit less amicable, being able to say, here's kind of the lessons that we learned from it. Here is why it wasn't working. And, you doing your post-mortem type of exercise. And here's the actions that we're doing to kind of mitigate that, to make sure that we make a better decision next time. And this next time, here's how we thought through it. Here's how we looked around these gaps and how we went from there. When it comes to adding in another vendor, showing the differential value, I think, is going to be critical there. I know, for example, with static analysis, like there's showing kind of what's the different. A lot of the big differential value there is time. Like, you're going to be spending less time to doing all of this work and trying to go and reach out to all of these engineering managers and directors trying to understand the product. Instead of you can kind of give them a preview of, here's what we think this looks like. Can you help us make sure this is correct? And then figuring out, just being really good at telling that story. Because ultimately, when you get to the C-suite level, it's a trade-off of time and money. And so being able to really kind of talk that out to them really helps that journey.
Awesome. Perfect. We are on time. Thanks, Tariq, for the conversation. I know you picked up a lot on our fireside chat conversation today. And yeah, thanks everyone for joining in. Hope everyone is having a good day. We'll see you soon.